city. As the siege continued, famine in Samaria became so great that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver and 1/4 of a cob of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Like I said, I bet you didn't learn this in Sunday school. These verses, which open a new story, stand in contrast with the end of the previous story. The end of the previous story, the Arameans stopped raiding Israel. Well, now we got King Ben-Hadad. He is going to start another war, and he lays siege to Samaria. So again, previously Aram quit its raids. Now we got war. Previously, through Yahweh and Elisha, the Aramean army was trapped inside the capital city of Samaria. But now the Arameans are outside the city of Samaria, laying siege to it. So the Bible loves these incredible reversals. Previously, the king of Israel had served a lavish feast to the Arameans. Now the people of Samaria are suffering from a severe famine. The siege of an ancient city cut off their food supplies. It cut off their food supplies, resulting in famine, resulting in prices for even the most peculiar food are sent skyrocketing. So the price of a donkey's head, this is really vivid, gross, but vivid. My 8th grade boys in confirmation, though, would love it. The price of a donkey's head, the most inedible part of an unclean animal, the price is exorbitant, 80 shekels. A shekel was basically a day's wage. So 3 months of wages to eat a donkey's head. Ugh. Now, it's not quite clear if dove poop was being eaten or was it used as fuel for cooking. But a cob was about a liter. It's a dry measure. So 1/4 of a cob is a cup. So 5 days' wages for a cup of bird poop. Oh. Now, as the king of Israel was walking on the city wall, a woman cried out to him, "Help, my lord king." He said, "No, let Yahweh help you." "How can I help you? From the threshing floor or from the wine press?" But then the king asked her, "What's your complaint?" And she answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give me your son, we'll eat him today, and then we'll eat my son tomorrow.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give me your son and we'll eat him.' But now she's hidden her son." Like I said, not in the Spark Study Bible. So an unnamed woman appeals to the king for help, because in ancient Israel, a king's responsibility to provide justice for God's people and to provide food for God's people. Now, the king thinks she's appealing for food. Sarcastically, the king tells her, "Go get Yahweh to help you." And you might have thought, what's that reference to the threshing floor and the wine press? Well, this is also sarcastic. He says, "Where am I supposed to going to get food for you? From the wine floor or the threshing floor or the wine press?" They're inaccessible because they're part of agricultural manufacturing. And you do that where? Outside the city walls. So the wine press and the threshing floor are completely inaccessible. So he's being sarcastic again and again. Now, note carefully. The woman appeals to the king not for food, but for really bizarre justice. She's not there to protest cannibalism, which is another terrible act that could occur during a siege. Instead, she's protesting and appealing for justice for just the opposite. She made a bargain with another mother so that each would eat their sons. She kept her end of the bargain. They cooked her son and ate him. But the other mother has reneged on the bargain by now hiding her son. And she wants the king to help him. Give me that other son so we can cook him and eat him. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now, since he was walking on the city wall, the people could see he had sackcloth on his body underneath. And he said, so may God do to me and more if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, stays on his shoulders today. So he dispatches a man from his presence. So in the case of Nahum, okay, remember, go back to Nahum. The king of Israel tore his clothes because he knew he was powerless to solve the problem. The king of Aram had sent a letter to the king of Israel, said, heal my general. King of Israel reads it. He knows he can't heal Nahum of his leprosy. He thinks it's a trick, and he's so angry or in grief, he tears his clothes. Now, however, the king again tears his clothes because he is powerless. He's powerless in the face of siege, famine, and cannibalism. So in the face of his helplessness, the king swears a death oath, which essentially is a death sentence against Elisha. And probably he's blaming Elisha for not using his power to serve the crisis of siege, famine, and cannibalism. If you remember, again, it's back in January, but after Elijah won the contest with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, he had all the priests and prophets of Baal killed, and then Jezebel swore a death oath against Elijah. Now, Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Before the executioner arrived, Elisha said to the elders, are you aware that this murderer has sent someone to take off my head? When the executioner comes, see that you shut the door and hold it closed against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? While he was still speaking with them, the king came down to him and said, this trouble is from Yahweh. Why should I hope in Yahweh any longer? So Elisha's response to King Jehoram's death oath against him is very different from Elijah's response to Jezebel's death oath against him. First, Elisha does not flee the country out of fear, as did Elijah. Instead, Elisha stays at his own house where he can be easily found by the king's executioner. Likewise, Elisha doesn't feel at all alone like Elijah felt. Remember on Mount Horeb, Elijah says, and I alone am the only one. And God says, there's 7,000, back off. Instead, Elisha is surrounded by elders with whom he shares his plans. So Elisha's response does seem to indicate, hey, he really does have double Elijah's spirit. Elisha discerns the king has put a contract on him, even before the executioner arrives. Elisha even knows how the king plans to execute him, cut his head off. So he instructs the elders, hold off the executioner when he arrives. Elisha also perceives the king has accompanied the executioner. He's dispatched against Elisha. So Elisha, he knows everything. that royalty is planning. So when he arrives, that is, when the king arrives, the king blames Yahweh. And he's given up all hope of Yahweh delivering Samaria from its dire situation. But Elisha said, "Hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh." That's that formula over 1,900 times in the Bible. Thus says Yahweh. Tomorrow, about this time, a measure of choice flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gates of Samaria. Then the captain, on whose hand the king leaned, said to the man of God, "Even if Yahweh were to make windows in the sky, could such a thing happen?" But Elisha said, "You'll see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat from it." So whereas the king blamed Yahweh and the king has given up hope, Elisha announces Yahweh's word. Deliverance is just a day away. Yes, you can think of Annie. It's okay. So in the place of eating inedible food costing exorbitant prices, large quantities of good grain will be available at the public square at bargain prices. So this comparison. It was during the famine 80 shekels for a donkey's head. Well, that's going to be replaced by 1 shekel for grain. So a seah is just under 2 gallons of dry grain. Again, a shekel's a day's wage. So remember, 5 shekels for a cup of bird poop. Now, for 1 shekel, you're going to get 2 gallons of grain. It's incomparable, unbelievable. Now, the king's command or captain, and was he the executioner? We're not sure. Is sure that Elisha's prophecy of Yahweh's imminent deliverance, impossible, can't happen. Now he says, even if Yahweh were to make windows in heaven, that goes all the way back to the story of Israel with Moses in the wilderness. Windows of heaven refers to how God rained manna from heaven. Elisha's reply to the king's captain is both enigmatic and foreboding. You'll see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat it. Now, there were 4 leprous men outside the city gate who said to one another, "Why should we sit here until we die? If we say, 'Let's enter the city,' the famine's in the city and we'll die there. But if we sit here, we'll die also. Therefore, let us desert to the Aramean camp. If they spare our lives, we'll live. And if they kill us, we shall die. So what?" So now the story takes a completely unexpected turn. Instead of focusing either on the king or on Elisha, it suddenly focuses on 4 lepers outside the city gate. And of course, they're outside the city gate because they're unclean and they're not supposed to enter the city. And they devise a plan to get out of being between a rock and a hard place. What's the rock and the hard place? If they enter Samaria, they'll die because there's no food in the city. If they stay where they are, they'll die because they don't have any food. So they decide, let's go to the Aramean camp where we might be killed, so that since we're going to die anyway, what the heck? It's just a matter of where they'll die. Except, who knows? Maybe the Arameans will actually spare their lives. So they arose at twilight to go to the Aramean camp. But when they came to the edge of the Aramean camp, there was no one there at all. For Yahweh had caused the Aramean army to hear the sound of chariots, the sound of horses, the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, the king of Israel has hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to fight against us. So the Aramean army fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving the camp just as it was, and fled for their lives. So when the lepers arrived at the Aramean camp at twilight, they found it empty of Arameans, but the camp was just as it was. So what the lepers don't know, but what we've been told, Yahweh caused the Aramean army to flee by producing the sounds of chariots and horses and a huge army. So it was a giant fake out. So the Arameans mistakenly think the king of Israel has hired mercenaries from the king of the Hittites, the king of the Egyptians, and so they just skedaddled. When these leprous men had come to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent, ate and drank, carried off silver and gold and clothing, and went and hid them. Then they came back, entered another tent, carried off things from it, and went and hid them. Then they said to one another, what we're doing is wrong. This is a day of good news. If we're silent and wait until the morning light, we'll be found guilty. Therefore, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we went to the Aramean camp, but there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but the horses tied and donkeys tied and the tents as they were. So at first, the 4 lepers consumed part of the leftover Aramean food, not surprising. Then they loot the camp of its silver and gold and clothing. It's like, we've hit the jackpot. And they hide stuff for themselves. But then the lepers realize if they withhold the good news of an empty Aramean camp, they're going to be found guilty. So they go and share the good news with the gatekeepers on watch. So it's ironical. The good news of the Samaria's deliverance is being delivered at the city gates by the very unclean men who aren't allowed inside the city gates. Then the gatekeepers called out and told it to the king's household. And the king got up in the night and said to the servants, I'll tell you what the Arameans have prepared against us. They know we're starving. So they left their camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking when they came out of the city, we'll take them alive and get into the city. And one of his servants said, let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, since those left here will suffer the fate of the whole multitude of Israel that have perished already. Let us send and find out. So they took 2 mounted men, and the king sent them after the Aramean army, say, go and find out. So the good news of the empty Aramean camp travels fast. It soon reaches the king. And even though the king directly heard Elisha's prophecy of Yahweh's imminent deliverance, the king interprets the empty camp wrongly. It's only an Aramean trap. So from the king's point of view, defeat, not deliverance, is at hand. He still views Yahweh as being against him. So the king sends out a recon team to check things out. So they went after them as far as the Jordan. The whole way was littered with garments and equipment that the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a shea of choice barley was sold for a shekel, and 2 shea of barley for a shekel, according to the word of Yahweh. So not only is the Aramean camp empty of Arameans, but full of leftover food and money. During their fright-filled flight caused by Yahweh, they've discarded their baggage. It's strewn across the countryside for miles and miles and miles. Neither the king nor his court plunder the Aramean camp. That's usually what happens when there's a military war between royalty. It's the king and his army that gets the spoils. Here, however, it's the starving populace of Samaria. They plunder the camp. That means they've deprived the king of controlling the food prices. They get all that food in the Aramean camp, they bring it to the city gate, and they sell it for next to nothing. If the king gets the food, the king can control the price of the food. So the word of Yahweh about ample food at rock bottom prices is fulfilled. Now, the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. The people trampled him to death in the gate, just as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. For when the man of God had said to the king, 2 shea of barley shall be sold for a shekel, a shea of choice flour for a shekel, about this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria, the captain had answered the man, even if Yahweh were to make windows in the sky, could such a thing happen? And Elisha had answered, you'll see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat from it. It did happen to him. The people trampled him to death in the gate. So Elisha's other prophecy, the one about the king's captain, is also fulfilled, but in a gruesome manner. The king had appointed the captain to take charge of the situation at the city gate, perhaps even to confiscate the plunder the people had. But the people who plundered the Aramean camp now trample the captain to death at the city gate. He saw the sale of grain for cheap prices, but he didn't eat from it because he'd been killed at the city gate, just like Elisha prophesied. So again, Elisha and the power of royalty. The king of Aram and his army put the capital of Israel under siege. Disastrous consequences for the trapped populace inside the city. Again, there was famine. The grossest inedible food is now being sold for astronomical prices and then eaten. Mothers have resorted to cannibalizing their own children. But through Elisha, Yahweh's word is delivered, by which the city's populace, including the least of its citizenry, lepers, is not just delivered, but it's enriched by looting the frightened, fleeing Arameans, what they left behind. King of Israel was supposed to be responsible for his populace's protection, provisions, and justice. But not only does the king fail on all 3 of these accounts, he blames Yahweh and Elisha. He puts a hit out on Elisha, which he's powerless to carry out. He loses all hope in Yahweh. The king of Israel hears the word of Yahweh, hears about Yahweh's tomorrow deliverance. But when Yahweh delivers on the divine promise, the king of Israel fails to believe it. He thinks it's an Aramean trap. The king's captain, upon whom the king depends, also doesn't believe the word of Yahweh as delivered by Elisha. So the good news of Yahweh's deliverance reported by 4 outcasts. The royal agents don't enjoy the plunder of the Aramean camp. Instead, the city's starving populace enjoys it. So the twin prophecies spoken by Elisha are fully fulfilled. The price of food will plummet because of the abundance of grain left by the fleeing Arameans. The king's captain is trampled by the plundering populace of the city, so he never eats the abundant cheap food which is available. So Yahweh and Elisha, not either foreign royalty or domestic royalty, are ultimately in control. They're in control in times of absolute scarcity, and they're in control in times of overwhelming abundance. So Elisha announces and Yahweh accomplishes stunning, spectacular reversals. Human impossibilities become divine possibilities. And let's see, I want to advance just because of time. Go over here. Elisha went to Damascus while King Ben-Hadad of Aram was ill. When it was told to him, the man of God has come here, the king said to Hazael, take a present with you, go to meet the man of God, inquire of the Lord through him, whether I shall recover from this illness. So the beginning of this story is meant to recall 2 prior Elijah stories. The second story we'll recall is from, well, the first story, the first story it recalls on Mount Horeb. No, we'll do the second one. I'm sorry. So in 2 Kings chapter 1, if you remember, the king had fallen through the lattice in his upper chamber in Samaria, and he lay injured. So he sent messengers telling them, go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, shall I recover from this injury? So in that one, 2 Kings chapter 1, the king of Israel sought to inquire about his recovery, but he did it from a foreign god rather than Elijah. Here, a foreign king, Israel's enemy, is injured, and he's smart enough to inquire about his potential recovery from Elisha. So Hazael went to meet him, taking a present with him, all kinds of goods of Damascus, 40 camel loads. When he entered and stood before Elisha, he said, your son, King Ben-Hadad of Aram, has sent me to say, shall I recover from this illness? But Elisha said to him, go and say to him, you shall certainly recover, but Yahweh has shown me that he will certainly die. So Hazael dutifully does what King Ben-Hadad instructed him to do. He openly acknowledges Elisha's superior status. He brings him 40 camel loads of presents. He describes his own king as Elisha's son. Elisha's reply regarding Ben-Hadad's recovery is mixed message. He will certainly recover. He'll certainly die. Elisha fixed his gaze and stared at him until Hazael was ashamed. Then the man of God wept. And Hazael said, why does my Lord weep? And he answered, because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You'll set fortresses on fire. You'll kill the young men with the sword. You'll dash to pieces their little ones, rip up their pregnant women. And Hazael said, what is your servant, who is a mere dog, that he should do this great achievement? And Elisha answered him, Yahweh has shown me you are to be king over Aram. So on the one hand, this is the second time Yahweh has disclosed to a prophet. First, it was Elijah on Mount Horeb. Now it's Elisha. Hazael will be king over Aram. On the other hand, Elisha now discloses to Hazael that not only will he be king, but his reign will be utterly disastrous for Israel. And then he, that's Hazael, left Elijah, went to his master Ben-Hadad, who said, "What did Elijah say to you?" And he answered, "He told me, you'll certainly recover." But the next day, Hazael took the bed cover, dipped it in water, spread it over the king's face until he died. And Hazael succeeded him. So when Hazael returns to the king, he reports only part of Elisha's message. The king will recover. Instead, Hazael fails to report that Ben-Hadad will die and that he himself will be Ben-Hadad's royal successor. And he also doesn't say anything that he's going to act in a deadly manner toward Israel. So Elisha's prophecy regarding Ben-Hadad's death and Hazael's royal destiny seems to have given Hazael the motivation to assassinate Ben-Hadad the very next day. So Ben-Hadad fulfills what Yahweh has disclosed and what Elijah has prophesied. So Hazael's palace coup also sounds an ominous note for Israel's future, since Elisha has also prophesied that harsh actions Hazael will inflict upon Israel. And we need to end it there because we've got church actually it's only in 11 minutes. So thank you all. And if you want to read about Elisha's death, it's in 2 Kings 13.